In this video, I'm going to skim the first sentence or so of each paper and try to identify transitions between paragraphs and ultimately major sections of the paper. So in the previous video, we established that the first 4 paragraphs are the introduction. There's also a little added space here, which sort of it feels like a conclusion. We've got the components of an introduction, there's an extra little space here, and then this begins with I begin with. So pretty sure we're on to the body. I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. So I've got a claim that we're beginning with, so I'm beginning a new section, and this sounds like an argument, a claim for the conclusion that we established up here. But I'm not going to be looking for the argument specifically in this video. I'm making a note of when I see argument, but I'm really just trying to get the major structure of the paper, and I don't want to get lost in the details at first. So I'm noticing I'm getting a premise for the argument, but really keep skimming. So I'm getting a claim here. My next point is this, another claim, and my next point connects it to this. So he's listing 2 premises in the argument for his conclusion. The uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated is deceptive. So he's referring to the principle of the previous paragraph, and now he's going to tell us it's deceptive. I do not think I need to say much in defense of the refusal to take proximity and distance. Presumably, proximity and distance were mentioned in the paragraph above. So I'm kind of sensing a section break, maybe, I'm not sure. So I've got a main claim introduced in the introduction, premise, talking about the premise. Now I don't need to say much in defense of something that is related to that premise. So maybe this is sort of a section of argument for the premise, but I'm still talking about essentially the 2 premises in the argument. I'm not sure if this will be a major section or not. Don't get lost in that until you have a big picture of the paper. And this paper is quite long, so I'm guessing there will be bigger sections. I do not think I need to say much in defense, blah, blah, blah. Okay. There may be a greater need to defend the second implication, so we're still talking about implications of that principle from the above paragraph and defending them. The view that numbers do make a difference, presumably that was something discussed up here, so this paragraph is still about defending an implication of the principle above. It might be thought that this argument has an absurd consequence. This argument, presumably one that's going on, so I'm still in the middle of something. The paradox here only arises, so presumably this is the absurd consequence just referred to, and an absurd consequence might be a paradox. So this is responding to that, still one conversation. If my argument so far has been sound, this sounds like a transition paragraph. So one thing that I'm on the lookout for especially is section level transitions. We often transition between individual paragraphs, make it clear how one paragraph is connected to the next or to the last. And then when a paper has bigger sections in a longer paper like this, sometimes you'll find a paragraph itself that stops and takes stock of what we've done so far and what we're going to do next, just to help the reader stay oriented in this bigger picture. So if my argument so far has been sound, neither our distance from a preventable evil nor the number of other people who, in respect to that evil, are in the same situation as we are, lessens our obligation to mitigate or prevent that evil. I shall therefore take as established the principle I asserted earlier. Okay, so it looks like all of this was about establishing that principle. As I have already said, I need to assert it only in its qualified form. So restatement of the principle. So I would say that we've got paragraphs 1 through 4 of the introduction. We've got the basic argument for the main claim, And most of the section up to this paragraph we just looked at, that is a transition paragraph, is about establishing this. So the first one he says is an assumption. I'm just going to assume this. And if you aren't on board with death by starvation is bad, well, you're not going to get any of the thing out of the rest of the argument. So this is part of the big picture argument, but this section is about arguing for this principle. So I'm going to make a note of that. So I've noted that this paragraph is recapping the argument so far, which was essentially about defending the principle that if it's in our power, blah, blah, blah. So what would you title section 2, paragraphs 5 through 13? I would either title it something having to do with in defense of this principle or setting up the basic argument. So the argument contains 2 explicit premises, this one and the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad, as well as a couple of implicit premises which are hinted at in the first paragraph of the paper, which is we do have the power to prevent these kinds of things, and we can do so without whichever qualification we insert here, without giving up something of moral significance. So there are 2 explicit premises. Only one of them is something he focuses on defending, and that's the point of the first section of the paper. Okay, let us figure out what the next section is. So reading on. The outcome of this argument, the one we've got so far, but notice how we're only on page 3 of 8. The outcome of this argument is that our traditional moral categories are upset. The traditional distinction between duty and charity. Okay, so we've got a new topic. Our moral categories, the distinction between duty and charity, what we classify as duty versus what we classify as charity is our new topic. And this feels familiar. Go back to the main claim here. I shall argue, well, we have established this claim, if his argument is sound, as he recognizes, and then there's this elaboration. Indeed, the whole way we look at moral issues, our conceptual scheme needs to be altered, and with it, the way of life that we have come to take, take for granted in our society. So this looks like maybe this isn't the main claim, but there's another main claim or something really important that's implied by this claim that is now being argued for. So maybe we have a 2-part main claim here. So something about duty and charity. Okay, I'm not maintaining there are no acts which are charitable. Okay, so he's clarifying what he's saying about this distinction. Despite the limited nature of the revision in our moral conceptual scheme, it would have radical implications. These implications may lead to further objections distinct from those I've already considered. I'm going to discuss 2. So this is a little transition paragraph or roadmap paragraph that sort of previews or introduces the next few sections. So I'm expecting 2 objections, not necessarily 2 paragraphs, but 2 objections. So I'm going to look for cues. One objection is what? I'm immediately going to look for where does the second objection start. So one objection is this. If this is an explanation, it has been argued by some. The second objection. Okay, so that paragraph was objection 1. I found the second one. The second objection to my attack on the present distinction between duty and charity. So again, we're attacking a distinction between duty and charity. It may be thought that my conclusions are so wildly out of line that there must be something wrong with the argument. So one thing I'm wondering without reading this carefully is this a comment on this paragraph or on this whole section? But in any case, it does seem to be a response to what he's saying about the nature of duty versus charity and how we distinguish between the 2. So point being, this might be a conclusion to the current section. It feels like one to me. I now want to consider some things, seems like, and we'd have to be reading carefully to really figure this out. Maybe it is still responding to this, but it feels new. I now want to consider a number of points, more practical than philosophical, which are relevant to the application of the conclusion we have reached. These points challenge not the idea that we ought to be doing all that we can, but the idea that it's by giving money that we can do the most good. So this is definitely a transition to a new claim, where this was still about what do we actually, so our first section was about this principle that establishes we should be doing a lot to stop death and suffering from starvation and such. And then the further argument is, and that means we need to rethink what we call charity. This isn't charity. This is something we ought to do. It's not morally optional. And now, assuming we have established that we have this great obligation, the next section is on the practical question of how do we fulfill this moral requirement that we have to do something? Is giving money the best way to do it? Or is there some other one? So this is definitely seems like a new section of the paper. Okay, so to recap, before we move on, we've got this transition paragraph. Section 1 was establishing that we have a duty to help by focusing on arguing for that moral principle. And then 2, noting that if this section was right, this means that it's not a matter of charity, it's a matter of duty. And next, we're going to consider practical objections, which means objections that, at least for the sake of argument, could admit the moral principle and the duty to help and yet have objections to the claim that we ought to be donating a lot of money. So some claim about what is actually within our power to do and what's the best way to help. So it is sometimes said that overseas aid should be a government responsibility, and so we shouldn't give to private charities. Response, this argument, it seems, okay, so objection, response. I do not, of course, want to dispute the contention that government, so still talking about governments versus private charities. Another more serious reason for not giving to famine relief funds is that until there, so this is a new potential practical objection that even if you think there's a duty to help, there might be this other objection that until there's effective population control, you're merely postponing starvation. So there's another claim. This point, like the previous one, is an argument against relieving suffering that is happening now because of something that might happen in the future. So talking about this one, a third point. So it looks like we're getting a third objection. Just how much we ought to be giving away. And looks like this is a pretty long paragraph. It is sometimes said, though, that, oh, hey, this looks familiar, conclusion. So what I'm seeing here then is for section 3 is that there are 3 new objections. Each one is a practical objection about even if we have a duty to give, there might still be objections. And 1, another 2, and then a third 3 objections and responding to them. And then there are these 2 paragraphs that we identified earlier as possibly the concluding paragraphs of the paper. And so now we might be wondering, is this a conclusion or does this actually still go with this section? But since there's a space here, it looks like it's being set off as the conclusion. So it probably is. And you might ask yourself, what does he choose to do to end the paper? What does this conclusion add or point us toward or ask us to take away from this paper? And then there's a postscript, which I also recommend reading, but I'm not going to talk about in this video. So now we have a sense of the overarching structure of the paper. There's an introductory section and then 3 major body sections and a paragraph section. A concluding section.